Hi everyone, this is Intro to Africa, Flagler College. We are moving on in today's discussion from the colonial period. Hopefully the structures and issues germane to that period are clear to you at this point, and you can sense the impact that colonialism had on Africa. It's at this point in the term that a discussion of The Dark Child, the novel by Kamara Laye, the Ghanaian author, fits. And as you need to write a paper on this, we should probably talk about it for a moment here. The reason I assigned that book at this point in the semester is really in a way to sum up the issues of the colonial period. The pressures that were placed on Africans in that period, the incentives that were provided by Europeans to invest in the colonial system, clashing with the traditional structures, the kinship structures and traditional structures of power, and so forth and so on, that were in existence before the Europeans colonized Africa. And Kamara Laye wrote this book. I mean, it's technically a novel because there are some fictionalized parts of it, but it is probably 90% autobiographical. He went through the experiences that the main character does. In fact, he has the same name as the main character. And so, the main character grows up in this town in the countryside of the country of Guinea, the town or village called Kouroussa, and his father is a metalsmith, works in iron and gold, and his mother has a reputation for having kind of supernatural abilities, is a village wise woman in a way, and the author, looking back with hindsight, really portrays his childhood and Kouroussa itself as this very idyllic place. His father, he talks about being in the workshop with his father and watching him, kind of work magic with these metals. He makes this thing out of gold, that was bought by a wealthy woman from the village. And his father tells him about this snake, right? The spirit of their people, the little black snake. And the greatest fear that Laye has, as he admits in the novel, is not being able to understand things like the black snake. Because his experiences, his education primarily, take him away from Kouroussa. And so he initially studies Arabic, but then switches to study French. And this was obviously very useful in the colonial period. It was the key to economic opportunities, to becoming, a translator, a middleman, a colonial functionary. And so he has to, he goes about as far as he can in the village school. And his parents then sent him to Conakry, which is the capital of Guinea. And he lives with relatives there, but he's exposed to the wider world in Guinea. And then at the end of the novel, of course, he ends up going all the way to Paris to continue his studies. And his mother is upset about this, and why are they taking my son away? Really is her sentiment, and I mean, in a way, the mother voices the plea that so many Africans had in reaction to colonialism, and that is, our lives, our traditional lives, are being disrupted by all of this, and Laye is constantly facing the question of whether he's making the right decision, right? To leave his homeland, to leave his home village, and to go off to all these other places. He's not sure that this was the right decision. And the opportunities he does have to partake in the traditional culture. There's a long section about circumcision, for instance, and also about these other kind of ritualized things, the test of bravery, where they supposedly, are sent out in the forest to confront Kondandiara, the lion, and all of this. He finds great beauty in all of this. He's writing primarily for a European audience, but in a way, he's working through his own experience, and it's I think the novel is in some ways cathartic for him, right? So, and then, at the end, he also talks about his, another character named, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I'm having a brain lapse. It's either Crack or Chalk. I can't remember. Anyway, it's kind of a strange name. I don't have the novel in front of me, unfortunately, but he talks about this friend of his who also is educated, and this guy gets very sick, and his mother takes him to the traditional healer. And Laie comments at that point, the traditional healers know a great deal. They do work wonders in healing people, but the problem is that we were so exposed to European things that we really didn't believe in that anymore. And the implication is, maybe if we had stayed in traditional society, we would believe in this, and my friend would have lived, right? That his belief somehow would have gotten him through that illness, and enabled him to continue to live, to beat the illness, right? So that the medicine prescribed by the traditional healer would have had a better effect because it would have been combined with a kind of psychological reinforcement, but it didn't happen for him, right? So a lot is lost in the experience of the colonial period. While, and I think in Lai's opinion, while he gained an education and all kinds of opportunities, those opportunities came at the cost of rejecting or never fully belonging to his traditional society, which was itself beautiful and good and commendable and worthy of belonging to. And so, the prompt asks you to consider the trade-offs, the pressures that were placed upon Africans under the colonial system. And I think that that book does a good job bringing up many of those issues and forcing you to confront them. So if you have questions or comments about the book, please bring them up on the discussion board. I think that it would be valuable to do that. And I think this book is really good at capturing those issues. All right, so we're moving on now. And our discussion today is going to be taken up with the question of the drive for independence, right? We've talked about the emerging nationalism in Africa and the emergence of an African intelligentsia who were driving these early moves toward nationalism and forming political parties, and also organizing publications and writing about the need to overthrow the Europeans. And there are a lot of complicated issues that go into this. I recall the discussion about tribalism and negritude and some of these other concepts that really animate the people during this period. Well, those ideas, the kind of conceptual parts of this, were put into action starting in the late 1940s. Between the late 40s and the mid to late 60s, nearly every nation in Africa became independent. And they did this often against the expectations and objections of Europeans, and in some cases after a long, hard battle against the Europeans, even long and prolonged wars of independence. But this period of transition is tremendously important for Africa. It happened in a sort of shockingly short span of time, especially given the way things were trending all the way up to World War II, that there was no hurry for the Europeans to, divest themselves of their territories in Africa, that these were, in fact, essential parts of the European empires, and, even the League of Nations in many ways backed this up. But on the other hand, after the Second World War, European countries, many of them, most of them, I think, were deeply in debt, especially those that held territories in Africa. Portugal maybe wasn't in such dire straits as Britain or France, or Belgium for that matter, all of whom were suffered pretty severe economic and infrastructural hardships during the war, to the point of nearly absolute destruction of large parts of their countries. Really, at the end of the war, for the first time, these European powers were starting to admit that the maintenance of far-flung empires was no longer a desirable thing. And this coincides in time with a kind of explosion of activism and protest in the colonial world, right? And Africa certainly experiences this, but it's perhaps, at least in the immediate aftermath of the war, much stronger in other places. You've got the War of Independence started by Ho Chi Minh, for instance, in Vietnam to overthrow the French. And maybe most famously, Gandhi in India right after the war, essentially talks the British into leaving, into pulling out of India, which was the crown jewel of the empire, the most productive colony that they possessed. It took some time for Africans in most parts of Africa to rise up to the level of organization and vehemence that Gandhi, led in India. But it comes in fairly short order. In fact, Kwame Nkrumah and others are contemporaries and really kind of peers of Gandhi and Ho Chi Minh and some of these other figures. Another major factor in this, in addition to the European debt and the kind of political weakness of Europe, in the face of the Organization of the United Nations and the ascendancy of the two great powers, and thus the second issue here is the Cold War, with developed countries lining up behind either the United States or the Soviet Union, and with the emergence of this Cold War, with all of its pressures, there was one of the byproducts of that is a desire, often under some duress or some coercion, of the European powers to pull out of places like Africa, because they began to realize that if they didn't, that those arguing for, and perhaps even fighting for independence in the colonial world, in the developing world, would turn to the Soviet Union for help, and in fact they did in some cases, right? So, the United States was putting, and sometimes the United Nations is a larger entity, was putting pressure on Britain and France and Belgium and Portugal to get out of Africa, to get out of India, to get out of Southeast Asia, to withdraw the yoke of colonialism, and to try to help these countries remain committed to the cause of democracy, or to become committed to the cause of democracy, and to line up behind the Western camp in the Cold War. Another factor here, though it's a little more nebulous, a little less obvious, is the population growth of Africa. Finally, by the mid-20th century, the introduction of European medicine and a kind of more secure infrastructure for the delivery of foodstuffs and other things contribute to both, and Iliff talks a great deal about this in the textbook, contribute both to a reduction in the death rate, which is the major factor in population growth, that people are living longer, and thus more people are around to populate the continent, but also perhaps not so much an increase in the birth rate, but at least an increase in the survival rate of the babies who were born, right? So all of that leads to kind of an explosion of population starting about mid-century in Africa, and that explosion has continued all the way to the present, and Africa is on course to grow exponentially in population. I think it has surpassed 1 billion people on the continent, and I think by something like 2080 there's supposed to be 2 billion people there, and that's going to continue to put pressures on the continent, on the various nations in the continent. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here, right? Now, from the European perspective, the different colonial powers had different attitudes about divesting themselves from their colonial possessions. Some were more willing to do this than others. Some were quite committed to it. Others were hesitating or kind of ignoring the problem. The French, for instance, especially under Charles de Gaulle, actually, that's complicated. De Gaulle is kind of around, and then he's gone, and then he's back again in the late 50s. And some of that political rise and fall hinges especially on the question of Algeria, which, of course, France had annexed and was politically part of France. But starting in the early 1950s, there was a war of independence that became bloody and brutal, and this was really the political hot button issue in France all through the 50s and early 60s, until France finally pulled out of Algeria and granted independence in 1962. But for close to a decade, there's this brutal war going on in Algeria. But France, in general, didn't really want to get out. They're still thinking along the lines of decades, if not a century, of kind of patronage or kind of a patriarchal oversight of Africans until they're ready for political independence, and in the meantime the French will enjoy all of the perks of having colonial possessions. That's still in the minds of many politicians. And after the war, France was, of course, totally devastated. I mean, large parts of France were just absolutely leveled by the fighting and the war. And so France saw their colonial possessions as a means to shoulder the burden of reconstruction, right? And they were trying to do that with these territories, and many of the African peoples over whom they ruled were not having it, and were fighting for independence. The British, on the other hand, recognized as early as, almost the immediate aftermath of the war, that they needed to make a transition from being an empire, being an outright colonial ruler, to having some kind of system where Britain really had close relations with its former colonial possessions, but didn't have any political or direct economic responsibility of them. In other words, they would continue to enjoy many of the perks of the close relations, sweetheart deals on raw materials and things like this. Still, access to what they saw as necessary infrastructural things like the Suez Canal. And so Britain sets about creating what is called the Commonwealth after the Second World War. And that's true for everything except for the settler colonies, because there were British settlers on the ground there who didn't want to move. They, had their possessions, they had their farms, and they wanted to stay there. And so Britain was in a tricky spot when it came to Kenya and Rhodesia in particular, and South Africa as well. But South Africa is a special case, and we got to treat that differently. Because it becomes completely independent of Britain and even breaks away from the Commonwealth by the early 1960s. So the British were less willing to get out of Rhodesia and Kenya, and there's a prolonged struggle for independence in those places. Belgium seemed to have no plan to get out of the Congo, or Rwanda, or Burundi, for that matter, until all of a sudden, at the end of the 1950s, they said, all right, we're done, and you need to have elections in 1 year from now, and we're going to pull out, and you're on your own, right? So there's this about-face, dramatic about-face, and some of this had to do with Cold War pressures, some of this had to do with realizations within the Belgian government that the colonies were a burden for them rather than a boon, and so Belgium does this rapid about-face, and that short period of kind of preparation is one of the things that causes problems in the former Belgian territories. These are some of the most volatile regions of Africa in the period of independence, and I think a lot of that has to do with the way the Belgians just all of a sudden divested themselves from these territories. The Portuguese, of all of the major colonial powers in Africa were the most reluctant to let go. They really kind of just ignored what the British and French and even the Belgians were doing, and wanted to continue kind of indefinitely with the possessions they had. The Portuguese were still in some ways hearkening back to an earlier day when Portugal was a major power in the world economy, and this is their last kind of hurrah to possess Angola and Mozambique. Gave them the opportunity to continue to extract raw materials. I mean, let's face it, Portugal is a very small country, very resource poor country, beautiful and all of that, but not blessed with a lot of natural resources. And so having these colonial possessions was seen by most Portuguese politicians as absolutely necessary for the well-being of Portugal. I already discussed the settlers in southern Africa. 1948 is often seen as the year of independence of South Africa because, as we'll talk about later, there was an election in that year in which the National Party, a primarily Afrikaans party, ends up winning the election and they begin kind of withdrawing from their intertwinement with Britain. And so South Africa, again, is a special case, and we'll spend an entire lecture actually talking about South Africa in the 20th century. One of the great questions, and I've sort of said this, so let me just underscore the point briefly, is the question of the slow versus quick transition. Still in many European minds, even those who were willing to admit that getting out of their colonial possessions, getting out of Africa was a necessary thing, they were thinking longer term than it actually happened. The short-term aspect of this was due almost entirely to African agency, to the pressures that Africans began to place on the colonial powers to get out, right? And those pressures take a number of forms, among them war and skillful political maneuvering, as well as kind of flirting with the communists, flirting with the Soviet Union, and stoking the fears of the Europeans that Africa would opt, as Ho Chi Minh did, for communism. So, all of that plays into this. African nationalism really takes hold by the end of World War II, though not in the same way everywhere. We have to look at the kind of demographics of nationalism here, and I've hinted at this already and talked about the way that this emerges, but let's talk about it circa 1946, 47, something like that. There were major urban movements all over Africa pushing for nationalism, right? Now, one of the ironic things about nationalism in Africa, and it's sort of tragically ironic in far too many cases, is that the nations here, with their territorial boundaries, were largely the creation of Europeans, meaning the boundaries that the Europeans drew in 1885 at the Berlin Conference, and which they put into effect during the scramble for Africa and the establishment of colonialism there, ended up being the boundaries of the emerging nations of Africa in the 1950s and 60s. And so the Africans, in a way, had to embrace a territorial entity that ran completely afoul of everything that Africans had considered about their own identities before that time, right? They embraced something that is, in so many ways, completely artificial. And so that's an irony, certainly. It's also one of the things that leads to many of the problems of the independent era in Africa. The post-colonial era, maybe is a better word. But that's the shape that nationalism takes, nevertheless. It took a leap of imagination for people in Africa to stop considering themselves primarily, for instance, Gikuyu, and to consider themselves Kenyans, or to stop considering themselves as Shona and to think of themselves as Zimbabweans, or to stop thinking of themselves as Igbo and start thinking of themselves as Nigerians, right? And arguably, some of that holding on to earlier concepts and earlier identities has remained in place all the way to the present, right? And certainly in places like Kenya, there are still ethnic tensions, pretty radical ones, that inform Kenyan politics and really kind of besmirch the reputation of a place like Kenya. And that's true in many countries for that matter, right? And it becomes horribly violent, of course, in Rwanda and some of these places. So nationalism is highly problematic in numerous ways. The demographic divisions. Okay, let me get back to this, right? So most of these nationalist movements are taking place in urban environments. In Nairobi, but not the entirety of Kenya, for instance, or in Lagos, but not the entirety of Nigeria. The rural populations, the place where most of the Africans lived, had a much more difficult time due to lack of access to education and other things, kind of wrapping their minds around nationalism. And so there was tension with traditional structures. The chiefs who had operated via, under the indirect rule systems as the local and regional authorities, certainly were not friendly to the idea of nationalism, because that would, of course, mean giving up much of their political power. Even when people began to buy into the concept of nation, they often did so in a way by saying, okay, what's in this for me, right? What part of my power is going to remain intact under this larger thing that we'll call a nation? That's, again, one of the things that leads to many of the problems of the post-colonial era. Nationalism was embraced in many places most vehemently by youth movements. And so, there are lots of political parties formed kind of in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. But it's often the younger people within those parties, in some cases even youth movements, that break away from the older parties. But young people who were the most ready to push for independence, and even at times to take up arms and do rather radical things to achieve independence. All politics in Africa is local, right? As is the case everywhere, as the old adage goes. But that's particularly the case in Africa, and so, nationalism operated on one level. Local politics continued very much in, I think, most instances, as it had even back to the pre-colonial period. There were places in Africa certainly that had not felt much the effects of colonialism. These people were the people who lived in those kinds of environments were less likely to get inspired by nationalism. And so you can perhaps sense the challenges that the nationalists were facing as they were trying to whip up support for nationalist movements, for independence movements, even when they gained the support of people in the rural environment, the local environment, it was often on terms that were maybe perceived differently by the different parties involved in this, or the local powers would extract concessions from the larger nationalist movements. And these are a number of reasons why post-colonial politics are so problematic. Okay, let's look at a few examples of the period of the drive for independence. In other words, the period immediate post-World War II to about the mid-1960s. By the way, the picture here at the bottom right of the slide, for some reason the mouse is not, okay, there it goes. This one right here is of Mau Mau rebels in Kenya. And I put it there because you can sort of see, this is the environment that, the people who actually fought the War of Independence in Kenya lived in. They lived in the fields. They lived in the countryside. And, Jomo Kenyatta and the other leaders of the nationalist movement were primarily urban dwellers and often educated urban dwellers. Some of whom, many of them had been to the United States or to Europe to receive higher education. Yet they had to work with people on the local level, often uneducated people who were living this very traditional lifestyle. I should say uneducated in the kind of Western sense. They certainly had their own traditional education structures, but those are some of the disconnects. And I think the Mau Mau revolt in Kenya really shows that quite effectively. Right. So let's move on to the examples here. Now there were already independent countries in Africa. In fact, there were a couple of places that had never really been colonized per se, though one of those is Liberia, and arguably it had been colonized because it was colonized by freed slaves from America, right? But it had not been taken over by Europeans in the late 19th century as much of the rest of Africa had. The same went for Ethiopia. Ethiopia had retained independence until 1936, when finally, after like 40 years of trying, the Italians finally managed to defeat an Ethiopian army, and Mussolini, claimed possession of Ethiopia. However, in 1941, that was swept away by the British armies, aided by the Ethiopians, and they evicted the Italians from Ethiopia, and Ethiopia regained its independence. So there's only this like brief 5-year period where Ethiopia was under Italian rule, but it didn't last a very long time. Libya had been colonized, sort of. That's not really the right word. Had been claimed by Italy at an earlier time, and the Italians had established, some colonial structures in Libya. But of course, Italy was on the losing side in the war, and so, as part of the settlements, the decisions made about what to do with the Axis and their dependence at the end of the war, all parties agreed that Libya, which was rather sparsely populated, most of the population of Libya lay, as it still does today, I think, in a few coastal cities like Tripoli and Cyrenaica and Benghazi, which of course has been in the news in the last few years quite a bit. And so they collectively granted independence to Libya in 1951 as an experiment to see what would happen, once an African country became independent. Well, in Egypt, a military officer named Jamal Abdel Nasser. This is a picture of him. He is, the kind of leading figure in Egyptian politics and arguably in all of North African and even sort of Arab world politics in the 1950s and 60s. He staged a military coup, overthrowing the king who had ruled Egypt up to this time. And we talked about how Britain had manipulated the parliamentary elections, often getting the king of Egypt to declare that the elections were invalid, and thus retaining, their hold on the Suez Canal and other things that were, the other goals that the British had in interfering with Egypt. Well, with this coup in 1952, this was a signal to the British that, the new government of Egypt was not going to tolerate their meddling. And it remained under military rule for about 4 years, with Nasser in charge, until he then, retired from the army and ran in an election as a civilian and became the president of Egypt in 1956. And immediately upon becoming, as he saw it, I think, or as he hoped the rest of the world would see it, the legitimately elected leader of Egypt, he nationalized the Suez Canal. He declared that, these European countries, especially Britain and France, were no longer going to have free access to the Suez Canal, that Egypt was going to take this over, and they were going to charge, massive fees and other things for the use of the canal. I mean, after all, it ran right through their territory, okay? Well, Britain and France were not happy about this, obviously, and this is their kind of last-ditch attempt to meddle in Egyptian politics. They talked the Israelis. Now, for when we talk about Egypt, we have to be aware of what's going on in the wider Middle Eastern world. Israel had gained independence, if we can call it that. Israel, of course, the land of Israel, or Palestine, as it's otherwise known, though not by the same people, right? The Jewish inhabitants call it Israel. The Arab Muslim inhabitants call it Palestine, they don't acknowledge necessarily the other name or the other identity. But the Jewish settlers in Israel, via mostly military maneuvers, seized control of most of the territory that is now Israel in 1948 and declare it to be an independent nation, a homeland for the return of the Jewish people. Of course, they did this against the objections of the Arab population, which was quite large, and that becomes the locus for political maneuvering and for conflict in the Middle East. And these other Arab countries like Egypt were, of course, not happy about Israel becoming an independent country, and a Jewish country for that matter, and so they began to kind of maneuver diplomatically, politically, militarily, making moves as if to prepare to attack Israel. And so Israel was ready for a fight. And of course, about a decade later, we're going to see we have the Six-Day War in 1967. So I'll come back to that one because Egypt is heavily involved in that. But Britain and France, partly because they didn't want the PR disaster that would come from this, and partly because they were really reluctant, I think, to use their own military, they convinced Israel to attack Egypt as a kind of preemptive strike, with the anticipation that Egypt is preparing to attack Israel, and they did this as a way to take over the northeastern territory of Egypt, and to claim that part of Egypt that had the Suez Canal. So Israel advances into Egypt in 1956, when the details of this arrangement between Britain, France, and Israel came to light, Israel was successful in taking over a lot of that territory, but even the United States condemned this, and Britain and France were left out in the eyes of much of the rest of the world as villains in the whole scenario. And the U.S. put a great deal of pressure on both of them and on Israel. And the U.S. was already supporting Israel militarily and economically a great deal in this time. They forced Israel to withdraw from the Suez, and Britain and France kind of, go home with their tail between their legs, as it were, and grudgingly agree to accept Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal. And Nasser comes out of that as the great victor, even though, militarily the Israelis overran Egyptian forces. Nasser emerges really as, this kind of can do no wrong Arab figure. All through the Middle East, he is hailed as a hero, and he's in a great position of strength. So that we're going to leave Nasser there, and we'll come back and talk about this, what happens later. Algeria, and I mentioned this already, under the leadership of a political party, really not a political party, more of an independence movement called the Front de Libération Nationale, or the FLN. The National Liberation Front would be the translation of that. They began to fight a guerrilla war against the French colonial structures and military structures in Algeria. The FLN recognized that they could not take the French on directly, militarily at least, and so they waged a guerrilla war for a number of years, acts of sabotage, massacres of French farmers in the Algerian countryside on some occasions, bombings in the city of Algiers and other urban centers. Algiers is an interesting city in this period of time because it was a very segregated city. There was a kind of French section of the city of Algiers, and then there was an Algerian or Arab section of Algiers. And the Arab section or the Algerian section was called the Casbah. So the song Rock the Casbah harkens back to Algiers. And the Casbah was rocked a number of times by bomb explosions and other things, but there's this guerrilla campaign staged from hiding places in the Casbah and other places, attacking French positions. And this gets bloody and brutal, and the French were committed to this. I mean, there were, tens of thousands, I can't remember the exact number, of French settlers living in Algeria, owning their own territory, and there were French politicians who were committed absolutely to the maintenance of Algeria, saying Algeria is France. We're not going to give up part of our nation, our territory, just because some of the people who live there are discontented. And so the politicians in France double down on this. Eventually there's a huge French military presence and police presence in Algeria, and with the institution of mandatory curfews and mandatory carrying of identification and random stops. I mean, they tried to make the lives of the Algerians difficult so that they would stop trying to fight for independence. But de Gaulle, who had initially supported the maintenance of Algeria, he sort of withdrew from politics in disgrace in the early 1950s, comes back toward the end of the 1950s, and he was the politician who eventually decides to pull France out of Algeria. So after a nearly decade-long bloody war, it may have claimed the lives of more than 1 million people, actually. The French withdrew from Algeria, and more for spite, I think, than anything, kind of the if I can't have it, nobody can sort of thing. The French, as they left, the French settlers burned their homes, their farms, they destroyed, they brought in bulldozers and other heavy equipment and destroyed their neighborhoods, rather than, which of course were the most developed and had the best facilities and other things. They destroyed all these things rather than let the Algerians kind of move into what, as they saw it, what they had built, right? So Algeria ended up as an independent country, but also an impoverished one as a result of this long and bloody war. By the way, there's a great film about this called The Battle of Algiers, or The Battle for Algiers. I can't remember which one it is. It used to stream on Netflix. I'm not sure that it's there anymore, but it's an absolutely fantastic movie about this situation. I think one of the best movies made about African history. So one I would highly recommend watching. Okay, a few other examples. Let's move out of North Africa now and talk about West Africa. Arguably the leading figure of this whole period of the drive for independence, not just in West Africa, but in the entire African continent, is the guy pictured on the top left of the slide here, Kwame Nkrumah, who was educated, and yes, I pulled this image off the internet, that's why it says Getty Images, right? It comes from the Getty Museum, I believe. But in any case, Kwame Nkrumah was educated partly in the United States. He spent quite a bit of time, I think, in Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken, but also some time in London. He was from what was known in the colonial period as the Gold Coast, what is now known as Ghana. And in the Gold Coast, this is one of the places where the British were trying to kind of slow play the transition to independence. They held local and regional elections in the late 1940s, and Kwame Nkrumah, with his leadership, the political party he belonged to, called the Convention People's Party, and this is a political poster of the CPP, they organized just incredibly well, got the message out to people all over the country, and the CPP ended up winning majorities in many of the locales in these local and regional elections. And Nkrumah had been put in prison by the British as a kind of rabble-rouser, as a saboteur and other things, but his strategy was essentially to, rather than accept independence on British terms, he wanted it on the terms of the people of Ghana, right? To do that, he organized his political party. The British were trying to establish political parties in Ghana, or in the Gold Coast, that would continue to be friendly to British interests, that would listen to the British when it came to their conduct of politics and things like that. They really wanted to just manipulate the whole process. And Nkrumah created the CPP and built it up as this popular party to counter the kind of the British guidance there, right? And the CPP ended up being incredibly successful, to the point that the governor of the Gold Coast had to admit that the CPP was the only party that the British ought to be working with, because it was the only one that people were accepting. Although the British did try to undermine the CPP, especially by appealing to the indirect rule systems, the chiefs, and even there were some people in Ghana, or in the Gold Coast, some parts of the Gold Coast, who had titles that were much grander than chief. This was the kind of ancestral home, for instance, of the kingdom of Ashanti, with the Ashanti Hene. That was the title of the traditional king of Ashanti. And actually there's this throne that goes all the way back for many centuries that the king has traditionally sat on, right? So there were these old kingdoms going back into the slave trading era that were still around. And the British said, well, if you go with the CPP, then they're going to strip you of your traditional titles. And so with British kind of manipulation, some of these traditional authorities formed their own political parties. And when the elections actually happened, so there were more regional elections in 1951, the CPP made even more gains, but the British kept putting off having national parliamentary elections until 1954, and that was enough time for them to undermine some of the CPP's appeal. And the CPP won something like 71 out of 106 seats in Parliament, but it was a pretty hefty number, but there was a credible opposition to the CPP. This meant limited unity for Kwame Nkrumah's country. He became the first president of Ghana. They chose the name Ghana after the old kingdom there that was around, back in the 9th and 10th centuries, which actually wasn't even in Ghana, or was now Ghana. It was in what is now Mali and Burkina Faso. But nevertheless, right, the country of Ghana was formed in 1954, and Kwame Nkrumah, who was a great proponent of Pan-Africanism, became the inspiration for many other politicians to act in similar ways, right? So Nkrumah had become friends with, among others, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, I believe Hastings Banda, who became the first president of Malawi after it was formed. All of these guys knew each other, and they were intellectuals. They were all Western educated, most of them in the United States. And they embraced this notion of Pan-Africanism and negritude. But Nkrumah, had to settle initially for the Ghanaian nationalism. He hoped to extend that further. He hoped to form a kind of United States of Africa. That was not to come to pass. But he had this very idealistic kind of rhetoric early in his career, really up into the mid-1950s. Now, something similar happened, and I realize this is kind of like, this is a whirlwind tour of the continent here in the independence era, but something similar happened in Nigeria. So Nigeria is one of the most complicated places in the world ethnically and linguistically. There are something like 250 different languages spoken, which correspond with that number of ethnic groups, right? There are, in Nigeria, several language slash ethnic groups that are quite large. The Hausa and Fulani in the northern part of the country, the Yoruba in the southwestern part, and the Igbo in the southeastern part. And, you know, all of these, and yet all of that fit under a single colony in the colonial era. And so Nigerian nationalism, almost more than any other nationalism, was a terribly difficult thing to comprehend for many people, right, whose loyalties lay with their traditional ethnic groups. And it's a nation that, I mean, I hesitate to say this, but probably should never have become a nation, at least not in the state that it was in. There was way too much potential for conflict. And this was especially the case because, again, the British tried to slow play this and gave favoritism to certain ethnic groups who were more friendly to British interests. And so the greatest political activism in the 1950s in Nigeria came from the southern part of the country. The Yoruba in the southwest and the Igbo in the southeast were all pushing for independence. The British had a better relationship, somewhat ironically, with the Hausa and Fulani chiefs who operated in the indirect rule systems in the north. After all, those places had tended historically to be better organized, to tend toward larger states. I mean, that the northern part of Nigeria had been incorporated into, for instance, the Songhai Empire, the Sokoto Caliphate, and some of these other larger kingdoms, whereas the south had tended toward microstates and even non-hegemonic entities historically, right? So the indirect rule system worked better in the north, even though these people were Muslim, and the south was becoming Christian. The British, you know, wanted to work more with the chiefs in the north, and so they put off independence. They put off elections until 1960, at which point the Hausa and Fulani had organized quite well, and in those elections, these northern ethnic groups ended up winning the larger number of seats, and they came to control the coalition government, meaning they held the position of prime minister or president. I can't remember which one it is in Nigeria, or was at that point in time, and also many of the kind of key positions, and had a slight majority in parliament. And this would lead to some of the tensions. Of course, I suppose if the Igbo and the Yoruba had been successful and won the larger number of seats, there still would have been problems with ethnic conflict. So, you know, this was almost bound to happen just because of the nature of the ethnic complexity in Nigeria. Sorry for the background noise here. I'm filming this at home, and a couple of my children, I think, are playing in the next room, and you may be hearing some noise from them. So sorry about that. Now, how much this is? Okay, last slide here for this lecture. Another example, moving further to the south. And this one, I think, is especially problematic, although I've said that about every one of these, so maybe I should just stop saying. Each one of these is unique. How about that? Okay. So as I said earlier, the Belgians in 1959, after really making no moves in this direction previously, announced suddenly to the Congo and to Rwanda and Burundi that in a year's time they were going to hold elections. Now, I'll deal with Rwanda and Burundi in a second. Let's talk about the Congo, okay? In 1959, there were likely fewer than 10 people in the entire massive country, which is like 3/4 the size of the continental United States, who had a university degree, all right, who had any kind of higher education. Less than 10, right? The whole infrastructure of the Congo was built to extract minerals and rubber and other raw materials from the interior, which was mostly dense rainforest, although in the south it begins to get into savanna lands. take them down the river to the coast, to the one little bit of access they had to the sea, and to the city of Kinshasa, or as it was known, as Leopoldville at the time, and to send them off to Europe, right? And so there was nothing in the infrastructure or kind of in the demographic makeup of the Congo that was ready for independence. Now, that doesn't mean that the Congolese didn't want this. The problem was that the other issue is that even if the Congo is not quite as ethnically diverse as Nigeria is, the ethnic diversity is exacerbated by the large territorial size of the Congo, right? That these ethnicities didn't necessarily interact with each other. They had no concept, most of them, of this large thing that was known as the Congo. Local politics were the only things they considered. And so the prospect of independence was so highly problematic that it's almost unthinkable that they allowed this thing to go forward, right? Now, there were a few educated people, and one of those was this fellow pictured at the top right of the slide here, Patrice Lumumba. Again, a really kind of interesting, yet enigmatic figure. Lumumba was Western educated, but he also had entered into some dialogue with the Soviet Union. Some of the nationalist movements had become radicalized a bit in Central Africa. Lumumba tapped into that. That doesn't mean he was a communist. It does mean that he had contact with the Soviets and sort of was listening to what they had to say. Now, Lumumba managed to organize a political party. It ran largely along the ethnic lines of his own ethnic group, but a political party, and he reached out to people from other ethnicities in an effort to try to prepare for the elections. Now, the elections that took place in 1960 were almost a free-for-all, okay? There were something like 100 different political parties who fielded candidates for this. Some of the candidates had never been outside of their immediate environments, their local environment, really, had no idea what was going on in other parts of the Congo. Some of them ran on, platforms that included campaign promises that they would bring about the resurrection of the dead if they were elected. Some of these were traditional authorities who claimed to have supernatural powers that they would put into effect. And pretty much everybody was thinking just along the lines of, what can I do to advantage my own ethnic group, right? Lumumba was one of the few who was thinking in larger terms and trying to reach out to other people. Now, Lumumba's party was the best organized, and so it managed to win the largest number of seats. And Lumumba was in the process of trying to create a coalition government. He actually went outside of his own ethnic area. He was visiting Katanga, I believe it was, in the northern part of the country, and trying to make partners, trying to kind of talk across ethnic lines, and he was assassinated. Now, this assassination was done almost certainly, there's a lot of evidence for this, with the collusion of the United States government, and probably almost certainly with the support of the Belgian government, because they saw Lumumba as a communist. Let's remember, this is 1960. The conflict in various conflicts in Southeast Asia and in Korea had been going for some time at this point. The political rhetoric was the dominoes falling, right? This is Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, who was worried about this. Churchill had given his Iron Curtain speech a few years before this in Missouri. There was, the Berlin Wall was being built. There were all kinds of fears in the West, and anyone who seemed to be friendly was taken as another Mao Zedong or Ho Chi Minh or another communist sympathizer who was going to bring about a communist state, right? So that's not to excuse, certainly. I think that the assassination of Lumumba is honestly one of the worst things that has happened in post-colonial Africa, because it led to the rise of Joseph Mobutu. All right. So in the aftermath of Lumumba's assassination, there was really no one who rose to kind of take the reins politically. There was, however, a military officer. He was a colonel, I believe, at the time, in the army of the colonial army of the Congo. He staged a kind of military coup, or it's not really a coup so much as it's a kind of strong arming, and with the military behind him, formed a military-backed government. This guy's name was Joseph Mobutu, and by 1965, he had consolidated his power in the Congo. He did so with the support of both Belgium and the United States, because Mobutu said, "I am not a communist." That really was all there was to it. Okay, and he promised that he would fight against any forces that were trying to introduce communism into the country. And in fact, he did, but he did so using the tactics and strategies of absolute brutality against his enemies, and the economic policy of what we call kleptocracy. Okay, that is rule by thieves, right? He stole, and we'll talk about Mobutu later, but he ended up stealing billions of dollars from the national coffers, and used his political hold to enrich himself. Mobutu would rule for 32 years as the dictator of the heart of Africa, and is a big reason why the Congo, even today, is one of the most dysfunctional places politically in the world, though hopefully things are trending along more normative lines there. Rwanda and Burundi. Again, a complicated situation, and I have treated them already, several times over the course of this class. The sudden transition to independent rule in Rwanda and Burundi planted the seeds of the Rwandan genocide. Some of them may have already been planted, but this was kind of the clincher. You're going to read in the last week of the course the Book of Bones, Murambi, the Book of Bones by Boubacar Boris Diop. And one of the things that the characters in that novel are going to bring up repeatedly is the perception that the Hutu and Tutsi have fought from time immemorial. They've always hated each other. And the characters say, no, this goes back to 1959. You can't see this as just a kind of eternal conflict between these two people that can never be solved. You have to look at what happened in 1959. And what happened in 1959, of course, was the Belgians said, you are going to become independent, and we want you to have democratic elections. Now, let's recall, okay, the Belgians had co-opted the pastoralist Tutsi elite, roughly maybe 10 to 15% of the population, and used them as their indirect rulers of Rwanda and Burundi. And they had co-opted systems that were existing to some extent, but those ethnic lines had really only hardened with Belgian encouragement, because the Tutsi were encouraged to be ruthless in their handling of the population, in collecting taxes and other things, extracting resources and other things that would be beneficial to the Belgians. And so there was a tremendous amount of resentment on the part of the agriculturalist majority, right, the Hutus. And so the Belgians then make this about face and say, now you have to have democratic elections. Well, who's going to win if it's a democratic election? Majority rules, right? Hutus are going to take power, and that is precisely what happened. And was it any surprise then that the Hutus end up turning around and doing exactly what they perceived the Tutsis have been doing to them, which was really just following through on the orders of their colonial masters? right? So the Tutsis immediately upon election begin to be oppressed by the Hutus, who start to put into place things like quotas on certain jobs, that there has to be, that only so many Tutsis who, of course, under the colonial system had greater access to education and economic opportunities. Now they were stripped, in many cases, of their privileges, and they were, limited kind of to the margins of Rwandan society, and that resentment continued to grow over time because, upon independence, the Tutsis also held maybe the largest share of the wealth in the country because of the advantage they had under the colonial period, during the colonial period. Now, seeing what happened with the election in Rwanda, the Tutsi leaders in Burundi, instead of accepting an election, essentially just seized power in 1960. Their elections came after Rwanda, so they canceled the elections, they seized power, and this the Tutsi minority ended up ruling over the Hutu majority. They carried out some massacres of Hutu, which led to sort of reprisal massacres of Tutsi in Rwanda. These two countries would often take cues from each other because they have the same ethnic makeup to them, and that ethnic division also spilled over into other countries that had both Tutsi and Hutu, like the Eastern Congo and Tanzania and Uganda and places like this. So the whole of the Great Lakes region was thrown into disarray, largely because of how independence proceeded there. Last example, Kenya. This is, of all the ones we have treated, except for Algeria, of course, the only settler colony that we've talked about today. I shouldn't say it's, the only one besides Algeria we've talked about. There were many fewer British settlers in Kenya than there were French settlers in Algeria. There were a few thousand is all, but they held the lion's share of the best land, if not the majority of land, arable land in Kenya. Okay, and these settlers had a great deal. They had a great situation going, and they were reluctant to leave. And so their appeals to the British government received enough support that the British were not willing to pull out of Kenya. They, in a way, were just kind of ignoring the problem and the desire the Kenyans had for independence. And, their plan was just sort of to maintain this thing indefinitely. Well, the nationalists, led by Jomo Kenyatta, who was also a Pan-Africanist like Kwame Nkrumah, and a proponent of negritude and, kind of trying to link up with people in other parts of Africa and other parts of the world in this push for independence, Kenyatta, who was an educated urbanite, ended up talking to people in the countryside and getting some buy-in, and this led to what is known as the Mau Mau Rebellion. Starting in the mid-1950s, the mostly rural farmers, provided with firearms by these urban intellectuals like Kenyatta, staged these revolts, mostly attacks on settler farms in Kenya, sometimes carrying out massacres of the British population, which led the British to send military troops into Kenya to quell the rebellion. This became incredibly bloody, and it got to the point where the British finally, by the mid-1960s, they put down the Mau Mau Rebellion, but there was a seething resentment to all of this that would continue, and the British, finally, under great pressure, both from the Kenyans and from the international community, decided to pull out of Kenya. Many of the settlers left, as had happened in Algeria. A few did stay. There are still, white British farmers living in Kenya all the way to the present. But they finally pulled out. And Kenyatta initially, and so we're going to move sort of past the initial phase of independence here for a moment. Kenyatta initially called for rather radical transformation of Kenya, land redistribution, seizing property from British settlers, and these were the terms of the Mau Mau Rebellion. They promised these these farmers doing the fighting in the countryside, that they would be able to seize control of the land that the white people held and all of that. But shortly after independence, Kenyatta began to walk back much of this rhetoric. And a lot of this was due to the incentives provided to Kenyatta and his cohort by the British government to maintain the status quo there. So even if Britain pulled out politically, they still wanted to protect their interests in Kenya, and the interests especially of the settlers who remained in Kenya. And so Kenyatta capitulated to British demands. And Kenyatta also began this pattern in Kenya that's continued all the way to the present. And Kenya is currently under the rule of the son of Jomo Kenyatta, whose name is Uhuru Kenyatta, of ethnic favoritism. The dominant ethnicity, or the largest ethnicity in Kenya, is the Kikuyu ethnicity. Though it's not a majority by any means. Kenya is quite complicated ethnically, like Nigeria and Congo are. Not quite as complicated, but close. And so there are large populations of other peoples there. The Luo, from whom, by the way, Barack Obama's father comes, the Maasai and others, have fairly sizable populations, and there has been ethnic tension since the beginning. Kenyatta began to, practice ethnic favoritism, giving the best deals to people from his own ethnicity, the Kikuyu, and this has led to resentments. Political parties have formed along ethnic lines there, and Kenya is really still, in many ways, living the legacy of the Mau Mau Rebellion and the grant of independence in 1966. All right, I know that was a lot of examples. This was a tremendous amount of information today. If you have questions about any of this, please ask them on the discussion board. Bring these things up. I'd be happy to elaborate on some things. Of course, ILIF, gives good information about a lot of this too. And my computer is telling me it's time to quit. It's moving away from this program, so we'll call it good there, and look forward to discussing these things with you on the discussion boards. Thanks.